This took place about 10 years ago when I was around 7 years old. My family has always traveled frequently, so despite my young age, I had already been on airplanes more times than I could count. Because of this, I was also quite familiar with our local airport and its layout. On this particular occasion, we arrived at our gate about 2 hours early. I remember waiting for roughly half of that time before realizing I needed to use the restroom. I told my parents, and since they knew I was familiar enough with the airport to find my way, they let me go alone. I made my way to the main restrooms, which were about a 5-minute walk away. These were actually the only bathrooms I knew of in the airport. However, since it was around 3 a.m., they were completely closed off for cleaning. Not knowing what else to do and not being the best decision maker at 7 years old, I started wandering around unfamiliar areas of the airport in search of another restroom. Eventually, I came across a hallway that seemed somewhat separated from the rest of the terminal. Toward the end of it, I thought I saw a bathroom sign, so I began walking in that direction. But about halfway down, I suddenly noticed a head peeking around a corner. It was a man. Hey kid, come over here," he called out. Without a second thought, I continued walking toward him, assuming he was an airport employee who was going to direct me to a restroom. But instead, he told me he was lost and needed my help finding his gate. At the time, I not only believed him, but I was actually excited at the idea of helping an adult navigate the airport. Since I was already familiar with a good portion of the layout, I felt like I was capable of assisting him, and the thought made me feel important. I told him I was happy to help, but I wanted to quickly let my parents know what I was doing. It wasn't even out of caution. I was just genuinely excited and wanted to share it with them. I reassured him I'd be right back, but as soon as I turned around to head back to my gate, the man started yelling, insisting we didn't have time because his flight was about to leave. I just replied that I'd be quick and kept walking. As I exited the hallway, I glanced back and saw the man hurriedly running in the opposite direction, down the stairs that led out of the airport entirely. At the time, I just thought it was strange but didn't dwell on it. I found a restroom I could actually use, went back to my gate, and quickly forgot about the whole thing. I never mentioned it to my parents. Fast forward to a few years ago, I was talking with some coworkers about strange childhood experiences when this memory suddenly resurfaced. Being older, it only took me a second to piece everything together and realize what had almost happened. It was a chilling realization to understand years later just how much danger I had actually been in. Looking back, I know I should have told my parents right away, but at the time, it didn't even occur to me. I just hope that guy didn't try the same thing with another vulnerable kid like me. I live in Portland, Oregon, but because of my job, I often find myself in a completely different city for the weekend, or sometimes even for a couple of weeks at a time. My work is similar to that of an event manager, which means I have to travel all over the country to attend different events. The company I work for covers my flights, of course, but it always felt like they put me on the absolute cheapest options available. I get it, they were trying to save money, but this usually led to some pretty unpleasant flight experiences. Saying I encountered some interesting people would be an understatement. Still, I didn't really mind all that much. As long as I made it to my destination safely, that was all that really mattered to me. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. One Sunday night, I was at the Dallas airport, waiting for my flight back home to Oregon. I had spent the entire weekend working and of course had to be in the office first thing Monday morning. I was already exhausted and practically had to drag myself to my gate. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier is that my flight had a layover. I was flying from Dallas to Sacramento and then from Sacramento to Portland. The first flight wasn't too crowded. I had a window seat and there was only one other person in my row, a middle-aged man. He looked pretty average aside from the fact that his clothes seemed a bit old and worn out. But honestly, who really dresses up for a flight? We exchanged some polite small talk for a few minutes, but I was so drained that I just wanted to lean against the wall and fall asleep. I pulled out my phone to watch something as I dozed off, but before I could even close my eyes, I noticed the guy glancing over his shoulder in my direction. At first, I brushed it off, assuming he was just trying to look out the window. But then, not even a minute later, I heard him mutter something under his breath, something along the lines of, "Oh great, just ignore me then." This happened multiple times, but I kept convincing myself that I was just overthinking it. Eventually, though, I noticed him aggressively scribbling in a leather notebook. Instinctively, I glanced over, and I quickly realized that the entire page was filled with tiny handwritten words. They were so small that I could barely read them. I tried to make out what he was writing, and that's when I saw it. My name. It was clearly written on the page. I must have told him my name earlier when we were making small talk, but seeing it written down like that sent a weird chill down my spine. I tried to read more of what he had written, but it was too difficult. The whole thing unsettled me so much that it became impossible to sleep. When we finally landed in Sacramento, people began getting off the plane, but the man next to me made no effort to move. It got to the point where it was our row's turn to exit, but he just sat there with his head down, forcing the rows behind us to start moving past. I finally spoke up, explaining that I had a connecting flight to catch and that he needed to move. Still keeping his head down, he muttered in a low voice, "I'm gonna follow you. You're not leaving this airport alive." I forced out a laugh, hoping he was joking, but he sounded completely serious. He finally stood up and let me out, but as soon as we exited the plane, it became clear that he was actually following me. My brisk walk turned into a jog, and when I looked behind me, I saw that he had sped up too. After about 5 minutes of this, I reached the gate for my next flight, still with the guy trailing right behind me. Doing my best to stay calm, I approached the desk and firmly explained that I had no idea who this man, who was now standing right next to me, was. At first, the employees laughed, thinking I was joking. But after they saw the urgency in my face, their expressions quickly changed. Hesitantly, they asked to see our boarding passes. I handed them mine, and so did the guy who had been following me. The employees made a few calls, and shortly after, they told me to follow them. They immediately led me through the boarding door and shut it before the man could come through. I was being boarded 10 minutes before anyone else. Eventually, the rest of the passengers were let on, and a woman sitting behind me asked what had happened. I gave her a brief explanation and she responded by saying, "Yeah, that guy had a complete meltdown the second you got on the plane." She went on to describe how he had been screaming and practically pulling his hair out. The police had to be called to take him away. Hearing this horrified me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that he might have actually wanted to kill me. It was obvious the guy was dealing with some serious mental health issues, or at least I assume so, since I never heard anything else about what happened to him after that. If that's the case, I just hope he got the help he needed. A couple of years ago, I had to head to the airport late at night to pick up my sister. She was flying in from Detroit and her flight was scheduled to land pretty late, I think around 10 or 11 p.m. However, it ended up being delayed. I got to the airport a bit early, but since my sister's flight hadn't arrived yet, I parked the car in the lot and went inside. Once inside, I checked the updated arrival time and saw that I still had about 20 minutes to wait, so I found a seat and sat down. By this time, the airport was nearly empty. A few people passed by every now and then, but overall it was really quiet. As I sat there waiting, a woman randomly walked up to me. When she got close, she asked me how to get to the city from the airport. Since the city was only about 5 minutes away, I gave her directions. It was simple enough. She thanked me and walked off in another direction. I didn't pay much attention to her after that, but at some point, I noticed that she had stopped near another seating area. Oddly enough, she didn't sit down, she just stood there. I wasn't really watching her though, since I had gone back to looking at my phone. A little while later, I glanced up and saw the woman staring directly at me. She was still standing in the same spot, a good distance away, but there was no mistaking it, she was looking right at me. I found it strange but looked away and went back to my phone, trying not to think much of it. Even so, I could still feel her eyes on me. Sure enough, when I glanced up again, she was still staring. It was weird, especially since she had originally just asked for directions to the city. I didn't understand why she was still lingering there, seemingly just watching me. I chose to ignore it though, and before long my sister's flight landed. I got up and made my way to the baggage claim area to wait for her. After a short while, she arrived, grabbed her bag, and we started heading out. As we walked out of the terminal, I happened to see the woman again. She was still in the airport, and still staring at me. I thought it was odd, but I shook it off and kept walking with my sister. We exited the airport and made our way toward the parking lot. Once we got there, I instinctively glanced back, and that's when I noticed her again. Now she was in the parking lot too. She was walking behind us, keeping a bit of distance, but definitely following. At this point, I was beyond confused. Who was this woman? Why had she been staring at me for so long? And now, why was she trailing behind us? She seemed to be picking up her pace slightly, and as we continued walking toward the car, I told my sister about her. The parking lot was pretty big, so it was a bit of a walk, and my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to turn around and confront her. I stopped in my tracks, turned around to face her, and even took a couple of steps in her direction. The moment I did, she froze. Then, without a word, she spun around and bolted in the opposite direction. sprinting across the parking lot until she disappeared from view. It was so bizarre. My sister and I just stood there for a moment, watching her vanish into the distance. We had no idea what was going on, but eventually we just continued to the car. After loading my sister's bags into the back, we got inside and I started driving out of the lot. But just as I was pulling away, I noticed a vehicle speeding into the parking lot. The car swerved in front of me, and as I got a better look at the driver, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was the same woman. She was behind the wheel of a pickup truck and was driving erratically, circling around my car recklessly. After a moment, she sped around and ended up behind me as I left the lot. At this point, I was really hoping she'd just keep going in another direction. But instead, she slammed on the gas, screeched her tires, and quickly made a sharp turn to follow me. I kept driving, heading away from the airport, but she stayed right behind me. When I made a turn, she did too. By now, it was late and the roads were nearly empty. It was pretty much just the two of us out there. Eventually, as I turned onto another road, I saw her take the turn way too wide. She lost control, slid off the road, and crashed into a tree in the grass. The crash wasn't too serious, but I immediately pulled over and called the police. After the crash, the woman jumped out of her truck and ran straight into the woods nearby. It was one of the strangest things I had ever seen. The police arrived quickly and I explained what had happened. They searched the wooded area and managed to find her not long after. Later, I found out that she had been high on drugs. It made sense. Her reckless driving, her odd behavior at the airport, and the way she had been staring at me for so long. She definitely shouldn't have been behind the wheel of a car, and looking back, I can't help but wonder what her intentions had been that night. A few years back, I had a flight home from Dallas to Chicago. The flight itself was smooth and uneventful, but the real story started after we landed. My flight arrived pretty late, around midnight. After making my way through the airport, I went outside to wait for my ride. Luckily, I didn't have to wait long. My friend picked me up, and since I lived fairly close to the airport, the drive back to my apartment didn't take too long. Once I got home, I headed inside. I was exhausted from traveling all day, and since it was already so late, I didn't waste much time getting ready for bed. Before lying down, I checked my phone and noticed a missed call from an unfamiliar number. It seemed odd. Who would be calling me so late? Just as I was staring at the number, my phone rang again. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to answer. I said hello, but at first all I heard was breathing on the other end. Then a woman's voice spoke. She told me that she had been on my flight from Dallas to Chicago, and that she was now outside my apartment. I wasn't sure if she was being serious, but it definitely caught me off guard. Confused, I asked who she was since I didn't recognize her voice. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she simply said that I needed to let her in, or she would break in. Then she hung up. That really freaked me out. I immediately went to my front door and looked outside, but I didn't see anyone. I checked the hallway, glancing in both directions, but still nothing. For a while, I sat there expecting her to call me again. I felt uneasy, and at that point, I wasn't tired anymore. I stayed awake for a few hours, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I just blocked the number and forced myself to go to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Nobody had tried to break in, and there were no more strange calls. However, when I stepped out of my apartment, I noticed something on my door, a sticky note. When I looked closer, I saw that it had a simple frowning face drawn on it. I had no doubt that it had been left by the same woman from the night before. That really unsettled me, but after that, nothing else happened. No more creepy calls, no more notes, no strange people lurking outside my door. I don't live in that apartment anymore, but to this day, I still have no idea who that woman was or why she did that. Part of me hopes it was just some bizarre prank, but honestly, I'll probably never know. Last summer, about 20 students, including myself, participated in a study abroad program in France through our university. We were spending a week in Paris before heading to the town where the university was located. Most of us booked a group flight deal through the university, while a few others traveled separately. The only requirement was that everyone had to be in Paris by the day we were scheduled to leave for the university. By the third day of our Paris stay, almost everyone had arrived, except for my friend Amanda. Naturally, we were all worried about her, especially since her phone wasn't working properly. The only way she could update us was through Facebook whenever she found free Wi-Fi, which wasn't very often. Her flight had already been delayed 6 times. Another day passed and still no sign of Amanda. At this point, we were all freaking out since we had no way of directly contacting her. The fifth day arrived and still nothing. That morning, our group had a scheduled bike tour of the city, followed by a boat ride on the river in the afternoon. We didn't return to our hotel until around 7 p.m. When I got back to our room, I found Amanda asleep. Since we were assigned roommates, I immediately woke her up and demanded to know where she had been. She told me that when she finally arrived at the airport, she was completely exhausted and broke. After multiple layovers, she had spent nearly all her cash on food, and to make matters worse, her bank card wasn't working. For those unfamiliar with Charles de Gaulle Airport, it is absolutely massive. Unless you have a map or understand French fluently, it's easy to get lost. Amanda was stuck, lost, broke, hungry, and struggling with 3 huge bags. As she sat inside the terminal, a well-dressed, good-looking man walked up to her and started speaking to her in perfect English. "You look tired. Do you need a taxi to your hotel?" Red flag number 1. What kind of taxi driver leaves his cab to approach people inside the airport? Without thinking too much about it, Amanda said, "Yes, thank you so much. I'm exhausted." The man smiled, picked up one of her heavier bags and told her to follow him. She did. He led her toward an elevator. Red flag number 2. She was already at street level where taxis normally pick up passengers. So why would she need to take an elevator? She got in and he pressed the button for the basement level. As the elevator descended, he pulled out his phone and started speaking in French. Amanda couldn't understand most of it, but she could tell it was slang. Still, something felt very wrong. When the doors opened, she realized she was in a service deck, an area meant for airport employees, not for passenger pickup. The place was dark, damp, and eerily empty, something straight out of a horror movie. The man stepped out first, still smiling, and said in French, "Let's go." Amanda hesitated. She took a few steps forward but then noticed something in the far corner of the deck. A green, unmarked van with an open trunk and no license plate. Then a large, intimidating man got out of the driver's seat. That's when it hit her. She was in serious danger. She knew she had to escape, but she didn't want to let the man know she was onto him. Since there was nobody around, screaming wouldn't help. But luckily the elevator doors were still open. Thinking quickly, she placed one of her bags in the middle of the elevator entrance and turned to the man. "I need my wallet. It's in the bag you're carrying." He stared at her for a moment but then walked over and handed her the bag. As soon as he did, she shoved him down with the weight of the bag and sprinted back into the elevator. He scrambled to his feet and lunged after her. She hit every single button on the elevator panel. Just as he reached her, the doors shut. She could hear him banging on them as she shot back up to street level. When the doors opened, she ran to the taxi pickup lane, completely shaken, and immediately broke down crying. A police officer noticed her distress and approached. She told him everything and he drove her straight to the hotel. On the way there, he told her that those men were likely part of a sex trafficking ring. They had been targeting young women inside the airport by looking for luggage tags indicating they had arrived from the US, assuming that American women would be more trusting. Back in March, when I was 19 years old, I had a strange and unsettling experience while traveling. I'm 20 now, but at the time, I was returning to Texas from California after spending spring break with my sister in San Francisco. Every college student eagerly counts down the days until spring break, and I had a great time, but I was also okay with going back to research papers and essays. I missed my friends, my bed, and my cat, though maybe not in that exact order. I was traveling alone, which I don't enjoy for a variety of reasons, and I had only one layover in Dallas. I especially dislike flying solo because I've had bad experiences in the past, and on top of that, I look much younger than I actually am. Most people assume I'm around 13 or 14, which I've always found frustrating. People tell me I'll appreciate it when I'm older, but for now, it's just annoying. The last time I flew alone, a flight attendant mistook me for an unaccompanied minor named Taylor. Another time, I was asked to move from the emergency exit row because you have to be at least 16 to sit there. My boyfriend was picking me up from the airport, and I was excited to see him. I made sure to wear the pink members-only jacket he had bought me and tried to look my best, though that's always a challenge when traveling. When my flight landed in Dallas, the weather was awful, heavy rain, lightning, and turbulence that made the flight terrifying. Still, I was relieved knowing I would soon be on my final flight to Houston. I took the train to the C terminal and made my way to the gate, only to find out that, due to the storms, my flight had been canceled. I was disappointed but determined to get home, so I got in line to exchange my ticket for a later flight. While waiting, an older man with a friendly demeanor stood behind me and struck up a conversation. "Are you alone?" he asked. Since the airport was packed with frustrated travelers all discussing their options, it didn't seem unusual. People tend to bond over shared inconveniences, so I answered truthfully and continued waiting. The airline agent at the counter told me I was lucky. There were only 2 seats left on another flight to Houston, and if I hurried, I could make it. I quickly took the train to the A terminal to catch my new flight, but upon arriving at the gate, I was met with the same news. This flight was canceled too. Oddly enough, the same man from before had followed me to the gate and was dealing with the same situation. I got back in line, exchanged my ticket again, and made my way to a new gate, only for the same thing to happen. This repeated at least 2 or 3 more times. I didn't want to give up. I had no other options. But I started noticing that this man was shadowing me the entire time. At the last gate, I realized he was still trailing me. He walked up and casually commented on our bad luck. As we stood there, someone nearby suggested that I rent a car instead. I politely explained that I wasn't old enough. The man then smiled and said, "Well, I'm old enough to rent one. How about this? I'll rent us a car, you can sleep and I'll drive." That's when I started feeling uneasy. The way he was looking at me set off alarms in my head. I hesitated before responding, then forced a polite smile and said, "No, but thank you. I'm going pretty far." His smile flickered, and then he suggested getting food instead. I was actually starving, so I was tempted. I almost said yes, but then I remembered a book I had read about a girl who was drugged at an airport and abducted. That thought alone gave me the strength to ignore my hunger and decline again. Still, he persisted. He pointed at a Mexican restaurant. "How about that place?" Something about his expression made me nervous. He was standing too close. I shook my head. "I told you I'm really not hungry." I could smell the food and it was making my stomach growl. But I didn't let it show and kept walking. He sighed. Okay, what about burgers?" His voice had a slight edge now, like he was getting annoyed. I ignored him, and that was the first time he seemed truly angry. His smile faded and he stalked off abruptly. I let out a deep breath, feeling relieved. I called my sister, not because I was scared yet, but just to tell her how pushy this guy had been. I settled into a chair, trying to figure out what to do next. It was around 9 p.m. and my next flight wasn't until midnight. I had already been in the airport since 5 p.m. If this last flight got canceled, I had no idea what I'd do. I had no money for a hotel and didn't like the idea of sleeping in an airport chair. The last time I fell asleep in public, on a train in France, a woman had tried to steal my backpack. But that's another story. About 30 minutes later, I looked up and saw him again. I curled up in my chair and pretended to be focused on my phone, but my bright pink jacket made me easy to spot. His eyes locked onto me and my stomach dropped. I stayed on the phone with my sister. "Well, there you are," he said, completely ignoring that I was in the middle of a conversation. I didn't respond. He pressed on. "So, I was thinking, you could come stay at my aunt's house with me tonight. That's where I'm staying. It wouldn't be a problem at all. You don't want to be alone in this airport all night, right?" I immediately shook my head. "No, I'm fine." I kept my eyes on my phone. He kept pushing, trying to convince me, and I had to firmly say no several times. I could see his hands clenching, his smile becoming forced. His jaw was so tense that I thought he might shatter his teeth. Then something dawned on me. He didn't have his luggage anymore. Earlier, he had been rolling a suitcase behind him. Now it was gone. If he hadn't left the airport yet, where did it go? And why was he still here? As I was processing this, he just stood there, staring. Then, after what felt like forever, he stormed off. At that point, I was too anxious to stay put. I grabbed my things and moved to a different gate. My phone battery was low, so I plugged it into a floor outlet and curled up between the chairs to charge it. An hour later, while talking to my sister about how creepy the storm looked outside, I saw him again. He was searching for me. I tried to make myself as small as possible, but my pink jacket was a dead giveaway. He spotted me. "Well, there you are," he said. I stayed on the phone. "Look, you need to come with me. You can stay with me at my grandparents' house tonight. They'd love to have you." I got chills. Something in his eyes told me he was lying. I slowly said, "You told me you were staying with your aunt." His face changed. His smug expression dropped. But instead of anger or defeat, there was something else. Amusement. Like he had just lost a game. He gave a small shrug. "Oh well." He walked away smiling. I called my boyfriend, who told me to find security, but the airport seemed strangely empty. I moved again and stayed near other people. At one point, a guy my age passed by and asked why I was on the floor. I snapped, "Because I want to." He laughed. All right. I apologized, explained the situation, and we talked for a while. Later, I saw the man again, but he didn't approach me this time. Maybe he was just a pushy, lonely guy. But something tells me he wasn't.